in 1969, one year before David Nolan invented the famous Nolan chart, political chart, Marsha was introduced to Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead through a chart just like it, in which her social studies teacher had been using Rand's ideas ever since. Marsha studied biology and psychology. She's written a number of articles on these topics for many publications, but most importantly, I'd like to say for ours, and many of them you will find on our website, but also on her website, www.fountainheadinstitute.com, which is a wonderful body of work, and I urge everyone to visit that site as well as ours. Marsha got interested in the Montessori method as a teacher through Beatrice Hessen's articles in the Objectivist back in the 60s. She founded Montessori School, the Council Oak Montessori Elementary School, in 1990 so that her children would have a Montessori education. And it was named one of the top private schools in Chicago in 2006, 2011 by the Chicago magazines. It's quite a stellar record as an educator. Marsha had so many education projects. It's hard for me to keep up with all of them. I don't know where you find the time. She's founded also the Reason, Individualism, and Freedom Institute in 2005. She's been offering a college-level program, and she sponsors the Great Connections Summer Seminar for students. I hope most of you, particularly the students in the audience, have received some information about that. Marsha today is going to be talking about a philosophical topic, and I think also a rhetorical question about communicating the objectivist philosophy, specifically the use of the word selfishness. So please welcome Marsha.
Thank you, David.
Take it away.
I'm going to talk from down here because I can't see a thing up there, so hope you don't mind. Okay. Have you ever had this experience? You become friends with Sally. She's a really great person, hardworking, honest, honorable, with integrity. Over the years, you find out that she doesn't have much of an explicit philosophy, but the ideas she does have and her actions show that she's very reasonable, that she's dedicated to personal happiness for herself and others, and that she's committed to freedom. Over the course of time, she's come to know who you are. She knows how you act and what you think, and she's begun to realize that you have a really different point of view. She's grasped that you have an explicit set of ideas that you use to direct her life, what you would call a philosophy. So one day you go out to dinner with her. She says, "How is it that you're able to see why George, a coworker, is such a bastard? He seems saintly to most people. How did you see through him?" You answer, "Because I know the bad ideas he's using to control other people. And some of those same ideas make him seem saintly to other people. I learned about them from the philosopher Ayn Rand." Then Sally says, "Gee, would you tell me more about her?" So you give a brief description of Rand's philosophy, talking about the dedication to reality, to reason, and the belief that everyone should act in a long-range manner for their personal happiness. Sally nods and smiles, eagerly agreeing with these views and soaking up what you have to say. Then you say, "So you see, Ayn Rand advocates an ethics of rational selfishness." Suddenly her eyes glaze over. She cannot make sense of what you mean. She's agreed with everything you've said up to this point, and you know it makes good sense to her because of her own personal actions and her views. But she simply can't see how that means being selfish, or how you are an example of a selfish person. Some would say that Sally is so imbued with the traditional ways of thinking about ethics that she simply can't grasp Rand's concept of selfishness. They would say that this makes her resist a self-interested approach. That's why her eyes glaze over. She's simply too steeped in altruism. But I would say otherwise. I would say that Sally's a very sensible person, and she just can't compute how your views are selfish because experience tells her otherwise. Experience tells her that the word selfish is usually used for a kind of person entirely different from you or her. Does this scenario seem familiar to you? Have you run into this problem when you've tried to describe Randian selfishness or use the word selfish with people outside of objectivist circles? Actually, I find the word often avoided within objectivist circles, all with good reason, in my opinion. In The Virtue of Selfishness, Ayn Rand made a forceful argument for claiming selfishness as a virtuous concept, worthy and necessary for promoting the best in human life as she envisioned it. She said, quote, "The title of this book may evoke the kind of question that I hear once in a while. Why do you use the word selfishness to denote virtuous qualities of character, when that word antagonizes so many people to whom it does not mean the things you mean?" To those who ask it, my answer is, for the reason that makes you afraid of it. Unquote. Continue quote. The meaning ascribed in popular usage to the word selfishness is not merely wrong, it represents a devastating intellectual package deal, which is responsible more than any other single factor for the arrested moral development of mankind. In popular usage, the word selfishness is a synonym of evil. The image it conjures is of a murderous brute who tramples over piles of corpses to achieve his own ends, who cares for no living being and pursues nothing but the gratification of the mindless whims of any immediate moment. Yet the exact meaning and dictionary definition of the word selfishness is concern with one's own interests. The concept does not include a moral evaluation. It does not tell us whether one's concern with one's own interests is good or evil, nor does it tell us what constitutes man's actual interests. It is the task of ethics to answer such questions. If it's true that what I mean by selfishness is not what is meant conventionally, then this is one of the worst indictments of altruism. It means that altruism permits no concept of a self-respecting, self-supporting man, a man who supports his life by his own effort and neither sacrifices himself for others, nor others. Unquote. Now, this is a terrible problem, and I, like many others, have been waging a war of words over this issue for years. But, as I indicated in the scenario with Sally, I found that trying to redefine the word selfishness is a losing battle. For one thing, what do you call those people who are not acting for the interest of others, and yet are not acting in their long-term self-interest? There are many of them in the world, as well as many people who are inconsistent in acting for their long-range self-interest. What do we call the actions of a businessman who tries to get money by giving less service than he promised? What do we call a brother who sneakily takes too much dessert at the dinner table? What do we call a friend who knowingly makes you wait for her at a restaurant because she decides to stay with her boyfriend a half an hour longer? How do we categorize these actions ethically in the Objectivist Ethics? In traditional ethics, they're usually called selfish. They certainly aren't altruistic. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary would concur with the conventional use of selfishness. The Oxford is known for its extensive research into the origins and uses of words. Unlike the dictionary Rand used, or seemed to use, the Oxford's definition of selfish qualifies its meaning with, quote, devoted to or concerned with one's own interests or advantage to the exclusion of regard for others. Now, on your handout, I put the definition and a number of other definitions, and also I tried to put all the quotes that I'm using in here. And the Oxford isn't alone in this qualification. Just take a look at the definitions at dictionary.com, such as Princeton's WorldNet Dictionary, quote, selfishness, stinginess resulting from a concern for your own welfare and a disregard of others. I've put a list of definitions from many sources on our handout. These definitions do not apply to those who think and act for their long-range interest. Such people are often concerned with the interests of others. Any rational businessman is concerned with the interests of his customers, or they won't trade with them for very long. Any rational brother would not take all the dessert because he knows the kind of hostility and conflict that would ensue in the family. Any rational friend does not inconsiderately keep you waiting because she wants to keep your friendship. Rand's characters often openly comment on their self-interested concern for the other's interests, as in this exchange between Dagny and Reardon in Atlas Shrugged. Reardon has just agreed to sell her the Reardon metal she needs to build the John Galt line. Quote, "Don't show that you're relieved." His voice was mocking, not too obviously. His narrowed eyes were watching her with an unrevealing smile. "I might think that I hold Taggart Transcontinental in my power." "You know that anyway." "I do, and I intend to make you pay for it." "I expect to. How much?" $20 per ton, extra per ton on the balance of the order delivered after today." "Pretty steep, Hank. Is that the best price you can give me?" "No, but that's the one I'm going to get. I could ask twice that and you'd pay for it." "Yes, I would, and you could, but you won't." "Why won't I?" "Because you need to have the Rio Norte line built. It's your first showcase for Reardon metal." He chuckled. "That's right. I like to deal with somebody who has no illusions about getting favors." "Do you know what made me feel relieved when you decided to take advantage of it?" "What?" "That I was dealing for once with somebody who doesn't pretend to give favors." Unquote. Generally, as illustrated here and elsewhere, her heroes are highly aware of each other's needs and desires, and trying to fulfill them. Since much of human life and the striving for human value revolve around our relationships with other people, it's only rational to take others' interests into account when pursuing our own. If we're logical and we can think in principle, we recognize that others have the same rights, needs, and legitimate expectations we have as human beings, and we respect those. The truly long-range thinker recognizes that honesty, awareness of the other, offering value for value, and minimizing emotionally driven conflict are usually the best interpersonal strategies by which to attain long-term self-interest. As Rand said, quote, "The basic social principle of the Objectivist ethics is that just as life is an end in itself, so every living being, human being, is an end in himself, not the means to the ends of the welfare of others. And therefore, that man must live for his own sake, neither sacrificing himself to others nor sacrificing others to himself. To live for his own sake means that the achievement of his own happiness is man's highest moral purpose." Unquote. Given the conventional usage of selfish, this is not selfishness. Now, despite the aforementioned problems with the word selfish, I don't want to discount Rand's concern about how its negative meaning is often used to discredit rationally self-interested people. And she brilliantly illustrates this, for example, with Reardon's family in Atlas Shrugged. Now, the Oxford's comment under their definition under 1b recognizes this use when it says B, used by adversaries as a designation of those ethical theories which regard self-love as the real motive of all human action. Unquote. Many of the definitions emphasize an excessive interest in self without specifying what that is. None names what the right amount should be. Of course, this needs to be defined by ethics. So the conventional usage of the word selfishness is a mess. What do we do about this problem with using the word selfishness? Let's go back and think about how we categorize ethical actions. According to Rand's argument in the Objectivist Ethics, there are at least two components to ethically judging an action. The consequence of the action to the person's life and the way in which the action was selected. Quote, "The standard of value of the Objectivist Ethics, the standard by which one judges what is good or evil, is man's life, or that which is required for man's survival qua man. Since reason is man's basic means of survival, that which is proper to the life of a rational being is the good, That which negates, opposes, or destroys it is the evil. Ethics is a code of values to guide man's actions and choices. In order to choose, man requires a standard of value. What is to be the goal or purpose of a man's actions? Who is to be the intended beneficiary of the actions? Unquote. Looking at the way objectivists analyze the issue of the beneficiary of action, we seem to have only two categories: selfish, rationally selfish, or altruistic. But some people don't act either way. The worst of them tend to want to do whatever they want to do to follow their desires, not their reason, not what's objectively good for them. They live for the moment in the short range. In her fiction, Rand had a variety of epithets for such people, such as whim worshippers. James Taggart and Betty Pope come to mind from her fiction. Rand also examines another kind of individual in an article she wrote called Selfishness Without a Self. This kind of person defined himself as being the opposite of the conventional, rather than pursuing his own first-hand goals and values. She describes this type of person as a, quote, tribal lone wolf, unquote, and she says he has a perceptual mentality. Quote, with all of his emphasis on himself and on being loved for himself, the tribal lone wolf has no self and no personal interests, only momentary whims. He is aware of his own immediate sensations and of very little else. Observe that whenever he ventures to speak of spiritual, that is, intellectual values, of the things he personally loves or admires, one is shocked by the triteness, the vulgarity, the borrowed trashiness of what comes out of him. The abdication and shriveling of the self is a salient characteristic of all perceptual mentalities, unquote. Rand doesn't have characters who we'd usually think of as lone wolves in her fiction. I mean, the way we usually use the word lone wolf, it kind of is associated with, for example, a psychopath or sociopath. The people she's talking about here are tribal lone wolves. Tribal because they define themselves against their group. They're lone wolves because they try to define themselves as the opposite of the group's conventions. Perhaps the closest character is the so-called poet, the Fountainhead, in the Fountainhead called Lois Cook, who was somewhat of an illustration of this. You know, she was always trying to do things the opposite of the conventional. In The Virtue of Selfishness, Rand argues, quote, man cannot survive like an animal by acting on the range of the moment. The alternative his nature offers him is rational being or suicidal animal, unquote. So Rand argues that this type of person does not have a human method of cognitive functioning. She says they have a perceptual mentality like an animal. But if such people are not acting for themselves or altruistically for the sake of others, for whom are they acting? Who is the beneficiary of the action? Now, I think Rand's right. They function like animals, and I think they often act for their animal selves. Apes recognize their own selves in the mirror, but of course they can't act by reason for their long-range self-interest. They're motivated to act in what they perceive is their interest, usually using perceptual awareness and judgments, which include feelings and desires arising from their nature, from the inside. Now, the same holds true for human beings, except that human beings can't live successfully by their perceptual judgments or by their feelings and desires alone. However, they are motivated to act in what they perceive is their interest, using perceptual awareness and judgments, I think I just repeated myself. Our nature is less set. It requires that we know more and understand more, plan more, in short, that we reason extensively about what we do with our lives. Yet there are many people who, in whole or in part, try to act like animals in pursuing their self-interest. What's worse and different is that they often use their reasoning capacities to achieve their short-range destructive goals. The most spiritually deformed use their reason to grotesque purposes, like a con man in a complex Ponzi scheme, or a Nazi intelligence officer figuring out the cleverest way to track down and torture someone. They're acting for themselves in an animalistic sense, that is, for their short-term bodily pleasures, their emotional goals, such as propping up their self-image. Ultimately, they lead miserable, fear-ridden, and anxious lives. In my experience, fair and honest people of good thinking and character usually use the word selfish in regard to this type of person, or to actions of an inconsistent person who sometimes acts short range, sometimes acts long range. So they'll use it in regard to the short range action. Rand deftly dramatizes this type with such people as the Fountainhead's Peter Keating. Keating will do anything to attain fame and fortune, including purposefully precipitating the death of his firm's partner, Lucius Heyer, who stands in Keating's way. Keating is dramatized as a conventionally greedy, grasping careerist of vaulting ambition. However, in her journal notes, Rand describes him as selfless and sacrificing. She says, quote, "A perfect example of the selfless man who is a ruthless, unprincipled egotist, in the accepted meaning of the word. A tremendous vanity and greed, which leads him to sacrifice all for the sake of a brilliant career. A mob man at heart, of the mob and for the mob. His triumph is his disaster. Left as an empty, bitter wreck, his second-hand life takes the form of sacrificing all for the sake of a victory which has no meaning and gives him no satisfaction. Because his means become his end. He shows that a selfless man cannot be ethical. He has no self and therefore cannot have any ethics. A man who never could be man as he should be and doesn't know it," unquote. In Rand's analysis, Keating is selfless because his life, quote, "takes the form of sacrificing all," unquote, to the opinions and approval of others. Quote, "a victory which has no meaning and gives him no satisfaction," unquote. Yet Keating isn't an altruist in the philosophical sense, giving up fame and fortune to help others. He doesn't give up the quest for money and position in order to help others like his love, Catherine Halsey, does. In what respect is he sacrificing? He sacrifices his own personal desires and goals, his love of Catherine and of painting. He desperately seeks others' approval and admiration for his vanity and greed. The approval and the judgment of others and his position in the social hierarchy are his ape-like substitutes for choosing and pursuing his own values and goals. In Rand's view, he lacks a full human self, in the sense of a reasoning, long-range thinker. He uses his intelligence like a clever ape to plot long-range career moves in the social hierarchy, not to achieve artistic or productive goals. No, such people as the tribal lone wolf or Peter Keating do not have full human selves. But then I must ask again, when this kind of person acts, who benefits from the action? Objectivism gives us no way to formally classify this behavior. Rand's colorful epithets do not name any clear ethical category for them. The consequence? If those who try to act rationally to pursue their self-interest are selfish in the Randian sense, everybody else must be lumped into the altruist category. But this doesn't make sense of all possible human actions. To deal with this problem, objectivists tend to apply the terms rational and irrational. Everything that purportedly follows principles of Randian self-interest is rational, while everything else is not. This conceptual tradition shows up on email lists, in articles, blog posts, conference lectures, and discussions everywhere among objectivists. However, classifying actions as rational and irrational muddies the ethical waters. These are epistemological rather than ethical terms. They refer to one's method of thinking, not acting. And they are some steps away from the beneficiary of action principle. Although ultimately your actions depend on your thinking, what you think does not always translate into action. You can entertain all kinds of ideas without putting them into practice. In fact, in order to arrive at truth, you must entertain a wide variety of ideas to check and cross-check with the facts and to analyze and debate. Further, sometimes people stumble upon good values without a lot of thought, or they reason themselves into objectively bad values and principles and positions through a process of reasoning and error. You can't examine every idea you have all at once. It takes years to look at the ideas you acquired in childhood, or even those unconsciously accepted in adulthood. Sometimes a person is so busy producing or working on their career that they haven't examined their ethical premises until a crisis or a serious conflict arises, which brings them to their attention. I mean, this is, the Hank Rearden example. Only the person who ignores contradictions brought to his attention is willfully refusing to see the truth. Feelings and conflicts might be the cause of this. And even here, these feelings can swirl around in a kind of half-conscious way if the person is busy or not skilled at introspection. The feelings may inadvertently keep the whole thing out of your attentional awareness. Only when a person realizes that he should pay attention to some facts, some contradictions, some feelings, yet purposefully ignores them repeatedly, then that person chooses to be evil by willfully refusing to examine the truth. We can apply this to analyzing Hank Rearden. Was he irrational, willfully refusing to recognize truth when he treated his family well? Or was he mistaken? Now, you all know that Rand viewed him as mistaken. Because why? Because he was consistently committed to the truth. But in this case, for many years, the important issues and conflicts had lain outside of his conscious awareness. He's a mortal human being. He's not able to think of everything. And Dagny recognizes this. She realizes that he's mistaken in his views and values, and she serves as a kind of tutor to help bring these things more to his awareness. In Rearden's case, he fulfills the first of Rand's principles of ethics, that he must be a person who chooses his values, he must reason to them. He thinks about, when he realizes that he needs to, he thinks about these values when he becomes aware of the issues. He errs in the second principle. The standard of value of the objectivist ethics, the standard by which one judges what is good or evil, is man's life, or that which is required for man's survival qua man. Rand acts contrary to his real needs. He does not always make himself the beneficiary of his actions. If the answer to the question, who is the beneficiary of action, is a key issue in the field of ethics, I think we need a more complex analysis, a more complex series of categories. In fact, it's a hard process to be consistent in long-term, long-range ethical thinking. That's why it's a virtue. So we need a lot more categories to categorize what our errors or our choices are. Having inadequate terms leads to cognitive chaos when you're trying to think about ethical issues. Now, I've identified at least 4 definite categories in which ethical action falls. This is a tentative analysis, and there may be more. I might be wrong in some things, but see what you think of this. Number 1, objectively altruistic. That is, truly giving up or destroying a greater value for a lesser. For example, a girl who gives up her pursuit of ballet, which she's loved all her life, to become a doctor because that's what her parents want. Or the biblical Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac because that's what he thinks God wants. Or joining a discussion group which forbids the discussion of certain topics as wrong and going along with that so as not to rock the boat. So that's one category. Second, objectively self-interested, or what we would call Randian rational selfishness. That is, using reason to pursue long-range objective self-interest for the achievement of personal happiness and fulfillment. For example, a painter living frugally and simply for 10 years in order to focus all her talents on developing and executing her paintings, because that's what she most enjoys doing in life. Or a businessman working 16 hours a day without vacation for 3 years, developing and marketing a new invention that excites him and will make a lot of money. Number 3, subjectively self-interested. That is, pursuing what is thought or felt to be one's interest, regardless of the long-range consequences or harm. For example, billing a customer for work you didn't do so that you can get paid more money. Or lying to one boyfriend about the existence of another in order not to deal with the conflict. Or paying a technician to set one up with cable TV that will not be billed to the cable company with the rationalization that the company is a monopoly. Number 4, subjectively altruistic. Claiming or appearing to act for the sake of others, appearing to be self-sacrificing in terms of money or recognition, while secretly pursuing the ulterior motive of power, position, and glory. Now, the ultimate example of this, of course, is Ellsworth Toohey. Usually foregoing short-term material interest for power and prestige. Such a person is among the most twisted of human beings, as they use their reasoning powers to achieve these ends, sometimes with complex, long-range schemes. Perhaps also objectively good and objectively bad would be clearer terms to describe what is meant by rational and irrational. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I've identified all the possibilities, and I think we need a vigorous discussion about this to discover them all. But ultimately, Rand was right on to complain that there is no term to describe the self-supporting, self-respecting man. Various movements, even those not definitely connected to objectivism, have attempted to create new terms to deal with this problem, such as self-fulfillment. Unfortunately, they now have too much association with New Age and leftist views. Egoism is at least a philosophical term, and I've considered whether we should be calling our view inspired egoism to telegraph the noble qualities packed into Rand's ethical views in a simple way. Unfortunately, egoism is not an easily grasped term, and its meaning is not immediately available to the average English speaker. And egoism's connotations have some of the same problems as selfishness. So would rational individualism or inspired individualism be best? That was another thought I had. I'm not sure, and I welcome suggestions, but let's leave selfishness to the whim worshippers and teach others that Rand's heroic way of living is inspired egoism or rational individualism. They will be much more likely to join us.
I'll kneel down. At times, Rand was very in your face with some of her statements, and I've always kind of have thought that the term selfishness was more provocative on her part to kind of generate a discussion and everything. Do you have any agreement or any comments to that?
Well, it seemed like that. I mean, certainly using as the title of her book was a brilliant marketing ploy. I mean, it gets loads of people to read the book because of the paradox. Virtue, selfishness. Selfishness seems to be a vice. But I think she was serious about using it because she followed up with the use of it, not in Atlas Shrugged, though. She brought up the issue, but they didn't really talk to each other about being selfish. But in the later essays, and of course, the people running the Ayn Rand Institute and all those thinkers very vigorously keep using that term. So.
I can't claim or pretend to resolve all of these controversies and issues. However, in your examples of the person who keeps someone else waiting or hogs the food, I would use such words as inconsiderate, rude, or thoughtless. And one could argue, I think, fairly logically, that that sort of behavior is not rationally self-interested. So that.
Well, I agree. It's not rationally self-interested, and those are good terms for it, but they're not exactly ethical categories. That's the problem.
I really enjoyed the lecture.
Thank you.
I agree, and I also think that in conveying objectivist ideas, also the using the word altruism also has a similar effect where it's seen as a positive thing. And so I was wondering your opinion on that. Do you think there's a better word to convey the idea of altruism?
That's a tough one, too. Yeah, no, I haven't thought about that. I mean, I've had the same problem with the word altruism because, of course, many people who are of goodwill think of it as meaning benevolence, and they don't understand the philosophical origin of it. I usually end up explaining this to people, but yeah, it's a problem.
You seem, I may be misunderstanding something, but you seem to rejecting the idea of saying rationally selfish or self-interested and irrationally on the basis of one is epistemological and one is ethical and mixing the two. But you said that subjectively selfish and objectively selfish, it seems like that's also a mix of epistemological and ethical. And I'm not exactly sure because ethics comes from epistemology, so I don't see the problem in mixing the two.
That's a good point. I think the problem is that people can use their reason in a very complex way, but for bad ends. Like an example of the Nazi officer or something. And so that's why I prefer to stay away from rational and irrational, because it doesn't telegraph to you right away whether it's the appropriate end goal. Whereas objectively and subjectively do that more.
Yeah. First of all, if I can
Fix that mic.
fix the mic. No, apparently not. Okay. Anyway, how's
Don't
that?
fix
I'm an entrepreneur. Anyway, first of all, yeah, excellent talk. I mean, I think you did a good job of sorting out something that we for decades have had problems with, is how we use the terminology.
Thank you.
I always thought that while Rand's title was good, The Virtue of Selfishness, very provocative. Language is for communicating, and you have to understand the audience. If you call someone silly, they probably don't take that as a compliment. The evolution of the word silly is it comes from the word selig, which means holy, and it used to mean holy, and then pure, and then kind of simple, and then simple-minded. If you can literally look at the evolution of words and how they strike the
Did you get that from John McWhirter's
I probably did,
course?
yeah.
Yeah, I did that too.
It's a
Yeah.
fine course, yeah. And I advise everyone to go to Teaching Company and,
Story of Human Language.
excellent course,
John
excellent
McWhirter.
course. Yeah.
Excellent.
But, I often use either rational self-interest or seeking your true self-interest or true happiness or something like that to indicate, because that has a positive turn. Who could be against self-fulfillment and self-realization? And for altruism, which again has a certain, who can be against altruism? I usually talk about self-abnegation or self-destructive behavior. And I find that kind of works because people say, it's not self-sacrifice when you forego something for your children because you value your children, but if you talk about self-abnegation, that's, so, that might be one to road test a little bit, see how it works.
Good ideas. One problem I find with trying to use rational self-interest is it sounds like you're talking about economic man.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't telegraph this rich, passionate, inspired approach to life that Rand gets across in her novels. You want to be inspiring to other people. You don't want to let them think, oh, you're just sitting there, I'm rationally calculating, okay, I'm going to be friends with that person, and I'm not going to be friends with that. You want to telegraph that it's a much bigger tent in terms of ethics than that.
Yeah, and by the way, something, of course, that we're keeping our eyes on is with the flourishing, you might say, of happiness studies. And looking at, everyone from Sam Harris to Pinker to all of these guys, I think we're going to have some interesting opportunities to interact with people who are studying this and sort of come up with what's a good way to describe what's going on there. So anyway, but excellent talk. Yeah, and Ray Rad probably agrees with all of this.
I want to make a modest proposal, but then ask a question. The modest proposal is, instead of objectively self-interest, is virtuous self-interest. Because objectivism is not just a self-interest, but it's sort of a virtue ethics, which is sort of a unique kind of ethics. But then I want to criticize that in my question, which is that it's always seemed to me that there was a problem with the fact that altruism is one word, whereas enlightened self-interest, objectively self-interested, whatever, is like a mouthful. And that's not just it's also it has importance for the objectivist theory epistemology, because in epistemology, each concept is designated by a word. Yes, you can use a hyphenated word, but it says something about how well we understand an idea that it says something, first of all, about the lack of an understanding or lack of an ethics of egoism or selfishness in the world, that we don't have a single word that can denote a positive self-interest. But it also seems to me a problem if we're going to define, or if we're going to use a sort of a mouthful to name our ethical system, when altruism is sort of one word. And that was my suspicion. It's always seemed to me a suspicion on my part that that's why Rand uses selfishness rather than self-interest, to sort of use one concept. And I wonder if there's any suggestions for a single word. That always seemed to me a limitation, for a single word to describe what we mean.
Yeah, I mean, egoism is the closest thing to it. But
Yeah, but it's a...
I don't know. I've been ruminating about this for years, trying to come up with a good word. So
but thanks
good points,
for the
though.
talk.
Good points.
Excellent talk as usual, Marsha.
Thank you.
I wonder if maybe part of the problem here is, this relates a little bit to what Ray was saying, is that maybe it shouldn't necessarily be tried. Maybe we shouldn't be trying to collapse everything into like kind of either a binary or just like group everything under a certain term. Like you have egoistic or I guess ethical egoistic to characterize one set of behavior, then you have altruistic to represent all the bad behavior, and we try to kind of shoehorn everything into both of those categories. But I wonder if it wouldn't be more descriptive if instead we were to use like the language of virtue. So we talk about, instead of characterizing like an act of courage as, oh, that was egoistic, if instead we just said, well, that's courageous. And then you might have some kind of analysis where you could talk about, well, what makes certain behaviors virtuous or vicious. And you might use terms like egoist or altruist on like this other level. But instead, is it possible that maybe we're just sacrificing too much descriptive meaning by not just by just trying to have umbrella terms in our more conventional sort of moral language?
Instead of being more specific when you're
Yeah,
talking
instead of
about
being
a
more
specific
specific.
action. And that kind of goes to what Don Hauptman, I don't know if he's still here, said, where he said, wait, oh, I couldn't see you, inconsiderate or rude. He's applying more specific virtue terms or ethical terms to the
Right.
situation. Good
Yeah.
points. Good points both.
Okay.
I loved your presentation.
Thank you.
I think it could be said that even people who act altruistically are acting in their long-term self-interest. For example, you use the example of Abraham and Isaac. And I think it could be said that, Abraham, in doing what he was about to do, he was acting with obedience and faith and in the hopes that he would be one day rewarded for those attributes. And I just wondered how you could respond to that idea that even altruism is eventually in your own long-term self-interest because you believe it's the right thing to do.
Well, human beings, and this gets into this idea of whether everybody's selfish, that problem. Human beings are always acting to fulfill some need of their own. Whether that need is objectively what their nature requires, it is a separate question. It's the same thing. That's something you have to figure out rationally. Now, in Abraham's case, I would say he may have been motivated by a long-term goal, but that he was deluded about whether it was true or not. It wasn't objectively in his self-interest to sacrifice his son. I lost my thought back there. Yeah, so... Right. Anyway, maybe if I think of what I was going to say.
Actually, Nathaniel Brandon, I'm sure you read it a million times, had a nice way of talking about that. It's actually a theory called ethical egoism. Psychological egoism. It confuses the fact that every action has a motive with whether that motive is selfish or unselfish. In other words, it's a tautology that every action has a motive. Abraham had a motive. The question is whether the motive was in reality selfish or not selfish.
Although I think her point was that in his thinking, his motive was self-interested because he thought it was going to be in his interest to obey God. But objectively, it wasn't in his interest, in our thought, because there was no God.
Yeah. I wasn't going to make this point because I believe in asking questions, but everybody's made a comment, so I figured I got a right to make a comment too.
I asked for comments, it's my fault.
I still disagree with what you say about selfishness. I think it's very important to keep in mind that the people who are really our opponents, what they are against, what they hate, is not false selfishness or selfishness that goes wrong or the false kinds. They hate rational self-interest. They hate man's actual pursuit of his dearest values. They actually hate what we love. It's not that they're confused about the nature of selfishness. The Catholic Church is not confused. It knows what selfishness is, and it's against it. And if we don't challenge that, and also the socialists and all who want to sacrifice, the people who attack, businessmen who are successful and all, the greatest successes, they're not attacking some false form of selfishness. They're attacking the fact that that man's a success. He's got his money and he wants to keep it. They're attacking what's good. And if we don't acknowledge that and realize it and try to paper it over by saying, it comes down to selfishness. And I don't think we can market away the issue that our opponents actually hate rational self-interest, inspired self-interest, and fulfillment too. The essence of it, the Catholic Church doesn't want you fulfilled. Not in any earthly sense. They want you fulfilled maybe up there, but they don't want you fulfilled. They don't want you self-realized, like Ed said. They just want you to give up yourself entirely. We have to defend selfishness.
Well, I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you that those opponents do know what we're representing. I just think I don't want to confuse everybody else because I want to convince all the people who are good people or who might come our way of what we really represent instead of letting the bad guys use that term to smear us constantly. That's what I'm.
Package deal that they deliberately had attached all those other bad meanings and kind of a package deal to the real concept of selfishness to discredit it. And
Well,
we don't fight that package specifically. She said I use the term for the reason that makes you afraid of it. You remember that?
So what do we call these other people I was talking about?
Explanation is needed, sure. You mean the people who really aren't against, who mistake greed, who mistake Peter Keating for Howard Roark?
No, I'm talking about what do we call the people who are, the businessman who's going to try to get something from you that they're not supposed to?
Well, not selfish.
Well, Bernstein,
What are we gonna call
Bernstein
them?
calls them cynical egoists. That's the term that I've seen used.
Manipulators, frauds, all kinds of things. There are all kinds of words for actual bad people, but selfish isn't one of them.
But we still need a category. At the high level, this high level of analysis, we still need a category for them, and that needs a name.
Sure.
How about victimizers?
Okay?
Well, one of the comments that one of the things that's coming to mind for me is this idea of, is your ultimate concern being your self-interest, your happiness, is that good or is that bad in people's minds? Because when you say, my ultimate goal is for my self-fulfillment, for my happiness, how do they perceive that? Because if they're in the mindset that that's just wrong, then more discussion can be had. But I think that the definitions that we have, Ayn Rand defined, I think, over 150 terms. And we're trying to spread our philosophy, and so there's a lot of jargon that we have that other people don't have. Mm-hmm. And in my discussions with people, I notice all the time, they don't really know what they mean when they say things like faith or selfishness or altruism and so that's part of our process is to communicate the ideas and to explain them and to define our terms. And I sympathize with what you're trying to say, because one of the things that I think that Ayn Rand said in one of her interviews, I think it was Donahue, when she was explaining selfishness, was that it's the virtue of self-esteem. And I like that presentation of the virtue, because she says it is you esteem yourself, you value yourself, and that's your ultimate value. And so I think that even when people have their eyes glaze over, you can give them another chance, you can approach the ideas, you can explain more, and maybe we can't reach everyone because they're too socially metaphysical to be reached, which I guess you said at the beginning of your talk. But social metaphysics, how would you differentiate the difference between someone who's altruistic and socially metaphysical? So I'll throw a question in there since you haven't gotten any so far.
Well, you'd have to know more about their reasoning process, right?
Between social metaphysics?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't altruism a form of social metaphysics? You just care about what other people think, or their judgments instead of your own?
That's not necessarily what altruism is, where you're acting for the benefit of somebody else at the expense of your own self.
If you were an altruist, wouldn't the reason be that you're a social metaphysician?
Maybe not. I mean, maybe the person came, took on religion as a child, hasn't really questioned everything, wants to be a virtuous person, believes this is really serious about being a virtuous person, and is trying to follow the ethics that way.
But that person was told that by the church. That's why.
Well, only to the extent that the person didn't really drill down and examine every premise. But have you examined every premise in your mind? It's hard.
Thank you, Marsha. While I agree that it would be nice to have a term, I'm thinking that we have so much work to do in terms of reaching out the general population, reaching out to them, reaching them. I don't want to say convert them, but make them think that, like you, for years I've been struggling, and I'm so familiar with the blank stare of like, oh gosh, she's that. And that's it, the conversation shuts down at that point. So what I find helpful, and the only thing that's worked, is when instead of seeing selfishness first, talk about, it does not have to be an extremely elaborate discussion, just a couple of things, and then finish it up with selfishness. And that's when you get them engaged and you finish it up with that term, you see the light, maybe a small one, but beginning to blink there. So maybe, like you said, the self-fulfillment term is being converted in popular culture to a different one. So maybe if we do enough talking to other people and reaching other people, we can actually take the term selfishness and have them modify the definitions, the idiotic definitions that keep, growing in the worst sense in terms of where we are, and basically take it back and have it used properly the way we think they should be used and the way Rand intended by selecting those terms.
Thanks.
I'm just kidding. Thinking about a different word that causes rhetorical issues is capitalism, and that's probably gotten a lot more attention from the objectivist movement and from other libertarian groups as well. I was hoping to get your thoughts on how that other word has worked in terms of like marketing issues and how to get the word across so that we could learn something to apply it to selfishness.
You mean?
Like, for example, there's a movement like trying to rename capitalism and just saying free markets without saying the word that causes harsh reactions from like the people you speak to. So what are your thoughts on like how that word has come to be used? So so that we could apply some lessons to this other discussion.
Well, I found it interesting that libertarians for decades talk about free markets to try to distinguish themselves from any kind of capitalism that might be government related or anything like that, and to stay away from the negative connotations. But I've noticed that since the financial crisis, they're starting to use the word capitalism more and trying to defend it, because it's still being attacked. It's almost as if so many more people are recognizing that they have to defend capitalism on moral grounds than they ever did before. And they're starting to use the word again. I mean, it wasn't originated by Marx. I looked it up one time in the Oxford English, and somebody earlier than him came up with it, but he was the one who really made it famous. So in a way, you know, you might want to stay away from the word capitalism in the sense that it's his term that he made famous, you know. But since they're using it, yeah, we have to defend it now.